My name is Advas Aldinger. I'm an associate editor at DevEx, and I'm really happy to be here today and looking forward to a really good discussion. We're lucky because we have panelists who represent a lot of different perspectives, so we'll be able to look at some of the key issues for the economy of the region in this next year from a lot of different angles, which I think will be a really rich conversation. And as we all know, with a variety of social and political changes in the region, there are a lot of questions about the region's economic future. And so it's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists who are going to help us unpack some of the key issues in the year ahead. So I want to introduce Herman Franson, who is the executive director of the Energy Intelligence Group and the president of International Energy Associates. Habib Kairouz, who's a managing partner at Rowe Capital Partners. And Dalila Khalid, who is a senior advisor at Laurel Strategies. And we have one more panelist who I hope will be joining us shortly. He's here, he's just getting a mic. And his name is Jihad Azur, and he's the director of Middle East and Central Asia at the IMF. So he'll join us once he's mic'd up. And I wanted to get this conversation going with a little bit of a broad question that you can each sort of answer, bringing in your expertise. And I wanted to ask each of you what you see as the key forces that are going to shape the regional economic outlook in 2020. Are there key countries that we need to be watching, key issues that you think are really going to shape and impact key decisions that may be made in the year ahead? So why don't we start with you?
Sure. So in terms of issues, let me start with that, and I'll let my co-panelists talk to some of the other issues and countries. But for me, I think the key issue that I am excited to see developing is the focus on women's participation in the labor force. Right now, we know that the region is losing approximately $575 billion a year due to social barriers impeding women from joining the labor force and advancing in their careers. So if our focus in the region is to increase economic growth and to diversify the economy, we know for a fact that we need to increase women's participation in the labor force. Right now, MENA, sadly, is at the very bottom of almost all of the indices measuring gender equality. In fact, 12 out of the bottom 15 countries rated lowest on the WEF Gender Gap Index are in the Middle East. So if we want to see our economies grow, there needs to be active participation by women in the labor force at all levels.
I would say from my perspective, if one were to look at the glass half full, which I tend to do in my business, I would say that the youth is probably the shining bright spot of the region. And for the region to really move forward with an economic development in the coming century, it has to be focused on creating competitively differentiated new industries to create jobs for the youth, and looking at competitiveness on a global basis as opposed to on a local, national basis. We're today operating in a global economy. Our industries, our countries have to be competitive on a global scene. And looking forward at the industries that are going to be competitively differentiated, moving forward, like alternative energy, digital economy, things like that are going to be key. And I would say in order to do that, one has to look forward to new vision at the leadership level, at the political leadership level of the various countries in the region, and a fundamental rethinking of the governance and the accountability of those countries to put in place the right long-term investments and to measure how they're being implemented.
I would say that I see basically the challenge in 2020 and beyond is kind of a triple whammy. One is the adverse impact of what's happening in oil markets. Oil prices, which were high in the period prior to 2015, have come down sharply by about 40% across the board. This is bad because the region is highly dependent still on oil income. When you look at the oil exporting countries, most of them now have reduced the percentage of GDP that oil takes in. In the case of the Emirates, it's only 30%, but in the case of Kuwait, it's 50%, and so there's everything in between. But almost all the countries are highly dependent on oil income for the budget. And that's in the range of between 85 and 90%, some slightly higher, some slightly lower. And export earnings in the same range. What does that mean? You find a 40% cut in your income and all of a sudden your budget is in trouble. And what do? You cut back on what you really, the IMF would tell you to cut back, but it has political implications. That all the benefits people receive, like healthcare, free schooling, and low cost petrol for the cars, low cost electricity. And I said, yeah, you have to be more like the rest of the world. But there is somehow, for the past 40 years, a kind of a silent agreement between the rulers and the ruled. You rule, but you give us in return benefits, and these are the kind of benefits that they depend on. So now, if this continues, the situation on oil price, and OPEC, if you're interested in, just released a major new report last week, which shows a much more pessimistic picture in the medium time than I personally do. They actually see between now and 2024, OPEC will have to further cut by more than 2 million barrels a day their production, which is going to be extraordinarily difficult, even if Russians and others are going to cooperate with them. So what does that happen? It happens at a time when the population bulge, or youth bulge, is just entering the market. People need jobs, want jobs. Budgets have been cut, so what they did in the past, put them in the civil service, put them in the army, can't do that anymore because the budgets have been cut. So you have all these young people coming out of secondary school with no jobs. Professionals has been easier, but even there you have a problem, but particularly for school leavers without much of an education, and it's creating a problem. They have the social media that they converse among themselves. They know what's happening and how the money is spent. Finally, is the more longer-term impact that OPEC in that study also very well describes, and that's the impact of climate change. And there's not only the climate change impact that has on Syria, which was part of the initial phase of the revolution, and the climate change on the agricultural sector of Iraq and of Iran, but if you believe, as Europeans strongly, and we not yet fully with the Europeans on that we have to shift fairly quickly away from fossil fuels, OPEC indicates what this will do to their member countries, and particularly to the Middle East. What it means, lower oil consumption peaking sometime in the early 2030s, and that's like tomorrow, almost in terms of investment policies. And then go progressively worse, start declining. And of course, in such a climate, prices won't change. So the days of $80, $100 oil that we have seen in the past may be over for quite some time to come, unless you get mishaps. If something goes wrong in Iraq, you could take 3 million barrels out of the market, then it causes a different picture. On the other hand, if sanctions are lifted on Iran and Venezuela, then OPEC finds itself with another problem, adding another 2 million barrels a day to exports. So it looks like a very difficult time. What is, of course, absolutely necessary now to take the move to diversification far more serious than they have done in the past 40 years. And it takes time. You don't do that overnight.
Thank you. Well, 2020, I see 4 forces at play. One is global impact of trade and trade tension, volatility in oil price, and volatility and slight decline in oil price, and the impact of the geopolitical tension will affect growth. Of course, one has to take into consideration that the MENA is a very diverse region. It has oil importing countries, oil exporting countries, small and large countries. Therefore, there are certain forces that are coming from the global developments that will impact economic performance in 2020. The second force is the re-emergence of social unrest. In our regional economic outlook last April, and then we have updated it in October, we started seeing, beginning of 2017, an increase in reported social unrest in the region. That is, in fact, the reflection of some of what has been said in terms of people feeling that the growth is low and it's not improving their inclusion. Therefore, there are certain increase in social unrest and social tension that would make reforms difficult to implement. The third force is the protracted or lack of structural reforms in order to address certain structural issues. One is productivity, especially in oil exporting countries who are not able to get out of the oil cycle, and therefore they are getting still very pro-cyclical. The high level of debt over GDP in oil importing countries that is not giving us and not giving them enough fiscal space in order to address social issues. And the high level of unemployment, especially at the youth level, and the low level of participation of women. The region needs 27 million new jobs in the next 5 years in order to sustain the current level of unemployment, which is 12%, which is at the youth level exceed 20% on average. Therefore, you have international, I would say, impact of the international global developments. You have some social tensions that are growing, manifesting themselves in different countries, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in recently in Sudan, or in Algeria, and also in other countries where we see the tension growing. The lack of structural reforms that has led those countries to a certain number of issues to address. And last but not the least, the issue that the region is facing the repercussions of conflict on conflict-related issues. This is the region where you have the largest number of refugees. Therefore, 2020 is a year where we expect growth to be lower than this year, in line with emerging markets when it comes to oil importing countries. For oil exporting countries, the good news that non-oil sector is growing, but not at the right speed, in order to allow the diversification movement that started after 2015 to compensate for the decline in oil and oil sector. And I think what is very important is if we look to the medium and long term, what we see that the oil will, starting 2030, 2050, in fact, the oil wealth will disappear, and therefore oil exporting countries need to accelerate their diversification and to get or to disconnect their economic management with the oil cycle. We see that the demographic development that is currently a blessing for the region, or could be a blessing for the region, will also start to disappear. Therefore, what is needed today, we need to accelerate productivity, and accelerating productivity would require to invest in sectors that, in a region that 65% of the population is below 30, will allow this region to grow faster. We need to address the social protection framework and to have a new social contract that address the weaknesses in institution, address the endemic issue of corruption that is, I would say, unfortunately shared among various countries. We need to re-establish a new cooperation framework among countries in the region, not the integration as it was advocated maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but there is great value in increasing intra-regional trade. Last but not the least, I think the region needs to connect more globally, not only with Europe, as it was mainly driven in the past, but also look at other key partners. Africa could be an important one for North African countries, Asia, including China, and reposition the region that still one of the strategic region, not only for oil, because also trade is channeled through the region. Therefore, I think 2020 is a year where, or the next 2 to 3 years are important years in terms of redirecting how the MENA economies need to be geared up.
And may I add one thing to it? One of the difficulties moving away from oil to other sectors is the expat population. Expat population in Saudi, about 70% of the workforce are expats. 90% in the private sector. 90% of the workforce in the private sector. In the UAE, it's 85%. In Kuwait, 60 to 70%. In Oman, 45%. What does that mean? many of those people, particularly at the working level, the construction and so, they get a wage somewhere around $300 max a month. A local cannot work for that money even if he wants to. You have to give him about two and a half to three times as much for him to live with a wife and a child in a small apartment. Now, how do you get that number down? Well, they're trying now, they're pushing them out since 2017, but what that does, it raises the cost of the smaller companies, which then many of them go bankrupt because they can no longer function with the higher labor cost. And this is really a problem that will take a very long time to solve. So you start the private sector, fine, big capital-intensive projects. But when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, the local level, it's going to be very tough to get to reduce the number of expatriates.
I want to turn to you. There was an article in October in International Advisor that said about 20 to 40% of wealth in the region is now held by or for women, which I thought was sort of an interesting statistic. And it cited increases in the number of women entrepreneurs, but I think we still know that women's management of wealth, women's access to the workforce is limited across the region. And it's been sort of stated very clearly what the impact of their full participation would be. And so I wanted to talk to you, to get you to tell us a little bit about what sort of efforts currently exist in the region to promote women's participation. What is working? What solutions have been effective in other places, other regions that might also work in the region to really accelerate women in the workforce?
So I'm glad that you pointed to the positive, because despite some of the negative statistics, there is a lot of progress being made. I think the UAE, Egypt, Tunisia stand out as really making serious progress. You and I had offline talk that there has been a lot of lip service paid to women's economic empowerment and how do we translate some of the hype into actual action. And what we've seen in those three countries in particular, as well as several others, that there have actually been significant constitutional reforms that give equality to women. Tunisia stands out in particular in giving equality across the board, including on election polls, 50-50. This is almost unheard of in the world, let alone in the Middle East. The UAE has done a tremendous job over the past decade. Women in the public sector there now amount to 66% of the labor force, 40-some% in the private sector. So we want to see that number higher. But this is very much because of the legal mandates around increasing women's representation on boards and in management systems. The same thing we've seen in Egypt. There's been a lot of great work there. They came out in 2017. El-Sisi came out and made that the Year of the Women. And though a lot of us were waiting with bated breath, there was actually a lot of translation of that commitment into action. We've seen the National Council on Women. They have set up a women's observatory that I understand will be issuing scorecards so that we can mark progress against women's economic empowerment goals. We have another project that's coming online now. In fact, our forthcoming moderator, Dina Sharif, with her organization, Ahead of the Curve, is actually working with the National Council on Women and the Banking Institute in Egypt to launch the Egyptian Gender Equality Seal. This is a really important initiative because what this will do will give us a way to monitor against data how public and private sector companies are actually performing with regard to meeting gender equality goals. And this will be building on a 2007 initiative, but actually creating a seal for Egypt that the government then can use across the board. Those types of initiatives are imperative because not only do they shine the limelight on companies that are succeeding, but it gives us really the tools to measure that type of progress. Another important effort beyond some of the, actually, let me take a step back and talk a little bit about investments. There's a great initiative out of Dubai. There's the Women's Angel Investor Network, as well as Mindshift Capital being led by Heather Henyon. And Mindshift is actually part of another fund called the $1 Billion Fund for Women. These types of initiatives are imperative because they're directly investing in women-led tech startups as well as women-led startups in general. And they're important not only because we need to invest in women, but we need to see women in charge of those investment decisions. So I was speaking to Dina Sharif actually about this issue, and while it's great that we have Wayne, the Angel Investor Network, we still need to have women represented on the investment committees making those decisions as well. So I could go on with a few other examples. I think another thing that we need to talk about is leadership championing, profiling women that are successful. I know we talk about that as kind of a soft thing, but it's actually, we've learned through empirical evidence that women serving as role models for other women is, again, critical if we are going to break the boundaries and break glass ceilings and enter into other jobs and ascend into career paths that weren't typically there for women or accessible women before. In the Middle East, this is really important because we see that female labor force participation is as low as 20% and lower in some countries. That's just the regional average. So if we want to break the notion of where women belong in the workforce, we need to see role models. In Egypt, there's a great effort that is being led by Amwal al-Ghad together with the Banking Institute and the 50th Forum. And they started this in 2017, and the idea was to basically grow the next generation of leaders in Egypt. And so they had this 50th Forum, which is the leading ministers, leading business owners from across the country, cultivating and mentoring these 50 women. And then a few months ago, they just graduated this first cohort. There's been a lot of influence, I think, on the psyche of the Egyptian public as to the role of women, especially in the public sector. We see now women assuming ministerial positions, very high-level ministerial positions, not only in Egypt, but also in the UAE. These are important changes for women to recognize that not only do they feel equal, but to see other women breaking the mold.
Great. Habib, you brought up the issue of youth and the need to create, and then we heard some statistics about the number of jobs that are going to need to be created just to sort of keep at the current levels of unemployment. So as we look to this next year and the year ahead, you're an investor, you work in venture capital. I'm curious what you think sort of needs to be done to build, and probably can't be done in a year. So what building blocks need to happen in the next year to start to create some of those private sector opportunities, to create the atmosphere where there will be those jobs for youth today and into the next 20, 40, 50 years?
I would say before I give my recommendation on this, I think the problem is substantially bigger than the number that Jihad just mentioned in the short term. Here we are talking about 50% of the population, women entering the labor force in masses. We're talking about 65% of the population under the age of 30 also entering the labor force in masses. And we're talking about oil prices being forecasted to drop by 50%. So unless we create jobs in masses in new industries, I don't know how we're going to be able to do any of this, right? So I'll give you some. I think new industries have to be created. I think these new industries have to be for the 21st century, not a replica of 20th and 19th century industries. In other words, we have to look forward where the world is going in terms of new. If we think fossil fuels are disappearing in 30 years, what's replacing them from an energy standpoint? Everybody's talking about clean tech. The Middle East should own this new sector on a global basis, not at the Middle Eastern level basis. We have the know-how. We know how to export. It's the one sector that we know how to export, right? So and I believe, based on my experience, seeing the proliferation of the digital industries and ecosystems in different cities around the world and in different countries around the world, that public-private partnerships are the way to go, where the public sector comes in with an organizing body, but the private sector has to take over immediately with the right governance out of the gate. It's an opportunity for some of these new sectors because you don't have to unbundle or dismantle existing corrupt infrastructures that's existing in legacy sectors. There's an opportunity to start from scratch with the right leadership, with the right governance, with a public-private partnership. So let me give you a couple examples. Silicon Valley owned the digital innovation market, still does today, but essentially controlled 90 to 95% of that market 20 years ago. Today, you look at New York, as it's become out of nowhere in the last 15 years, the second biggest market in terms of investment in new technologies. focusing on two subsectors, digital media and financial technology. How did it happen? You had something called the New York City Investment Fund, or the Partnership for New York City, which is a publicly sponsored initiative that's backed also by some high-profile private equity investors in New York, who came together and said, we need to diversify the economy of New York and start creating new sectors beyond Wall Street. What are some of the other industries that have created jobs historically in New York? The fashion industry, the retailing industry, the financial services industry. So a body got organized, the New York New Media Association, that brought together investors, people from traditional media, as well as public sector individuals, as well as entrepreneurs, put them all in one room and created a body that grew over time, that over 10 years was instrumental in getting traditional old sectors with new innovative companies, with capital and public policy regulators to work together on creating new companies in digital economy and e-commerce and digital media. 10 years later, the public sector was not needed anymore. All these people sprinkled on their way, and the industry is here to stay. Phase two of exactly the same body, the same entity, focused on fintech and health tech, which I'm not involved in, but I've been involved in the first two. And in fintech, they said, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to bring a bunch of investors together in one room. We're going to bring the CIOs of every financial services organization, the CIO organization of Goldman, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, BID, so on and so forth, put them all in one room and start identifying new technologies and new companies that are being created in New York to sell into this existing infrastructure. In other words, in both cases, we looked at what is differentiated about New York City and what is it that's going to give New York a competitive advantage on the global scene as we create these companies. So I'll give credit here, unfortunately, that didn't go anywhere, but that started in Lebanon with the central bank a few years ago when the central bank created something called the BDL Circular 331 and unlocked $400 million of capital to be invested in new digital companies. That was unprecedented for the region because, and in terms of capital availability relative to innovation, the supply-demand equation got completely whipsawed from the other side. So there was a huge opportunity to put that money to work in creating this sector. But instead of doing what New York City did in identifying what is Lebanon known for, it's known for its banking sector, so there was an opportunity in exactly the same sector I just mentioned for New York City, around financial technology. What is Lebanon for? For its tourism sector. There was an opportunity to invest in innovation around ecotourism and things like that. So where it fell short is that phase one was unlocked, and all of a sudden, $400 million was chasing the same 20 companies, as opposed to in the US, $400 million would be chasing 5,000 companies. So it wasn't orchestrated in a way to create the output of entrepreneurship or try to import some companies like Israel, for example, did, where Israel tied the US and the Israeli markets together. Canada did exactly the same thing. Exactly what was described in the New York example, the Canadian pension funds and the labor-sponsored funds in Canada did exactly the same thing, focusing on the US as the ultimate market. The Middle East should look at its 300 million people as one market, but should be looking at the entire globe as the ultimate market, especially around sectors that we have expertise in exporting.
Thank you. Herman, one of the big things that is on the horizon next year is the Aramco IPO. And I'm curious what you think the impact of that IPO will be, what sort of valuation it might get, especially in light of questions about oil prices moving forward, and sort of where it fits within the broader Vision 2030 and the need for efforts around diversification.
Well, first of all, I think it's absolutely needed, the IPO. There are questions raised about it, not related to Aramco. Aramco is the most profitable company in the world. It has the highest market cap of any company in the world. But what they're trying to find out now, when you make 3, maybe 5% available to investors, first in Saudi and later maybe outside Saudi, you're trying to find out what is the actual value of that company. And on the extreme lowest side is about 1.1 trillion. On the high side is what MBS would like to achieve 2 trillion. Most estimates have it somewhere around the 1.5 to 2, but there are a lot of different estimates. And much of it will depend on the opening also, what is happening in the market. Because unfortunately, they're going to reveal how much of the shares will be made available, initially in Saudi Arabia, on the 5th of December. That happens to be the same day as the OPEC meeting. Now, if OPEC does not achieve a consensus in December on what to do about reducing in 2020 further the production of both OPEC and the 10 non-OPEC partners of OPEC, then a negative outcome of the OPEC meeting would have an impact on the launching of the MPO in Saudi. I don't know why they do it on the same day, as I would have thought they know, because Prince Abdulaziz knows very well what is happening on the IPO as well as in OPEC. But that leaves some uncertainty. I think within Saudi, the market probably be very well subscribed because it's made very attractive to Saudis to buy those shares. Banks will make even credit available for locals who buy those shares. And already promised a significant part of the profits will be dedicated to, at the end of next year, to distribution for the shareholders. Foreigners in particular are a little bit more edgy at the moment because of things that happened in the kingdom, and we're all aware of it, the Khashoggi affair, the attack of the Abqaiq facilities, which nobody ever believed was possible, but it did happen, and the overall regional situation of uncertainty. But we'll see if the initial step is going to be successful in Saudi, and then we'll see how they will go further. Initially, they did not want to launch it in places like New York or elsewhere, because you can sue, for all like the 9/11 victims could start a lawsuit and claim damages, which you can't do in the kingdom. So there are a lot of issues, but the most crucial one right now is to see what happened basically on opening day, and at what they value Aramco, how much will be made available to those who are buying it, institutional as well as private investors within the kingdom, and then see how it's going to unfold.
Jihad, one of the, and you mentioned this, is the sort of growing social unrest in the region and growing inequalities. What do you see as some of the key sort of inflection points in the year ahead? Are there specific countries, specific issues, decisions that you think could really generate more social unrest? Are there opportunities to take actions at certain benchmarks to reduce it? And what do you think really sort of needs to be done? Are there policies that need to be changed?
I think it's very difficult to predict where the unrest will be next year. I will start with the last leg of your question is, what needs to be done? The level of growth that the region is enjoying is not enough in order to address the protracted issues that the region is facing. We're growing at an average of 3.5–4%. The region needs at least 6% level of growth. And therefore, we need a paradigm shift on economic management. If we improve women participation in the region to be equivalent to the average of emerging markets, in the next 10 years, we can generate $1 trillion of additional output. And therefore, this is one area that will grow the economy. It's not something that will create challenge to the labor market. The second example to illustrate that, access to finance in the region is one of the lowest. Access to finance to SMEs is 6%. On average, in EMs is 16–17%. We did recently study if we improve access to finance, we can create additional growth of 1% per year and create additional improvement in jobs by 1.5%. Therefore, clearly there are avenues where you can make a dent or transformation in the economy. Same, we did recently also work on if you bring the barriers between Maghreb countries, for example, one of the lowest integrated region in the world for a population that is almost the same in terms of culture, economic behavior. You can also increase the level of output, and instead of having a segmented market, you can have 1 million population market. Last example I would like to take is technology. The issue that is facing many of the startups or the technology company is you need to get accreditation, or you need for in each market where you want to operate, you need to have, again, to establish a presence. And therefore, when you look at the potential of the market that has one of the highest utilization of social media and mobile technology, and when you look at the e-commerce, is one of the lowest, 5% of the commerce is done electronically. Therefore, one simple thing is to remove the barriers, for example, in one segment of the economy, which is technology. Therefore, there are definitely certain area of reforms that can be done, and this require a paradigm shift. And what is the paradigm shift about? Is how to improve productivity that is low in the region. How to reform labor market, and not to keep looking at, even in oil exporting countries, the difference between expats and locals. One of the issues that expats in UAE, an economy that has been not growing fast over the last few years, saying we earn money here, we are very much interested in investing and earning assets here, but you need to change some of the regulations. Therefore, reforming the labor market, improving access to finance, as an example, and it's not an exhaustive list, addressing some of the issues that currently are creating artificial barriers, allowing investment to go into the productive sector, are examples of things that can be done despite the geopolitical tension or all the problems that we are facing, and can succeed. We did recently a study that was published last week on the trends in capital flows. You see that the region is attracting capital flows, but on the portfolio side. And capital flows went up, and the region is one of the largest issuer. And with Aramco privatization, it will be one of the largest issuer in the EMs. Yet, when we look at FDIs, since 2008, the region was not able to recover. And there are reasons for that, and then can be addressed. I think we are still in the region consider economic and social issues as secondary issues. And even in our meeting today, we are coming at 2 p.m. in the day, where most of the political issues that the region is facing are because of social and economic issues. Why people are on the street in Lebanon is because of social and economic issues, governance issues. Same in all countries. Big part of the tensions that are currently politically taking place in the region is because of that. The lack of creating jobs in the public sector, private sector, led to a bloating public sector, both in the military and in the civilian side. Therefore, I think we need to have a different approach to economy and economic management. We need to put it again at the center stage of any policy making. We need to have it analytical and fact-based. And this region has great potential. 65%, we're repeating ourselves, are below 30. It's wealth of talent. Highly connected region in terms of utilization of new technology, should not miss the opportunity of the fourth industrial revolution. Because the future of work could be positive or could be negative. Could get you out of the market or could allow you to do a leapfrog transformation. Therefore, I think we need to have a paradigm shift. We are a year or less than 2 years from 2021, where we will celebrate the 10th anniversary of Arab uprising. What have we learned over the last 10 years? I think it's very important to look at some of the issues. I was mentioning oil exporting countries. The oil wells, it's not the oil price will, or the oil will disappear. The oil wells could be depleted in 30 to 50 years, which means diversification should start today. Is the diversification that is taking place is the right one? I'm not quite sure yet, because productivity is very low. It's still around the state. And I think it's very important to look at the balance sheet approach. And even with privatizing some of important companies, still we need to look at the balance sheet and the role of the state in the economy. Therefore, I think we are at an important turning point. 2020 could be a year, because Saudi will be chairing the G20 2021. we will do our meetings in Morocco. I think we have 2 years where we can bring some of the issues that the region is facing that are not typical for the region. Bring them to the center stage of the discussion and for the region to open up. Africa is a growing continent. Morocco is benefiting from that. Egypt is not benefiting enough from that. Asia is growing double digit or high single digit. How the region is benefiting from that? Only in exporting oil. Therefore, there are plenty of things that needs to be done, but I think at the beginning, we need to rehabilitate the importance of economic issues in the policy making, which I think at strategic level is not yet there.
Great. Well, I want to make sure that we get to some of these questions, so I'm going to throw some of these out there. You brought up one of the issues that someone raised, which is what are the prospects for increasing financial inclusion in the Middle East? And will the region be able to harness the fintech tools and resources to promote SME growth and serve the unbanked and underbanked? And I'm curious what you think about that, or what sort of needs to be done. You mentioned that there possibly need to be some regulatory or policy changes. I'm curious on those things, whether you think there is the political will to move forward, because we can sit here and...
Very well. You're mentioning Egypt. Egypt is one of the countries that has been moving in this direction. What needs to be done in order to increase in financial inclusion is not an instrument or a product. It's a holistic approach, because addressing the financial inclusion ranges from addressing some of the, I would say, the regulatory framework to firm-specific issues. Therefore, you need to improve along the value chain of sectors, starting from the nucleus dimension to the widest dimension. There are certain pieces that are missing in the value chain. For example, some of the regulatory issues, some of the information-based issues, credit bureau, etc., and the utilization of technology for the not the S, M meaning the micro level. And there is one dimension that is missing, is how to grow a large medium company to a large company, where this is where the capital markets play an important role. Therefore, in fact, along the whole cycle of life of a company, there are certain number of actions that are needed. And it's definitely something in a region that doesn't lack capital, has good financial institutions, and also has a good level of entrepreneurial spirit in it. Therefore, yes, access to finance is important for SMEs first, but also for the inclusion of the marginalized groups, women, rural, etc. And we saw some cases in different countries where it made a big impact in order to improve the livelihood and the overall social integration.
Great. We're almost out of time. And so I wanted to give you guys maybe a chance to make one last comment. And as you do that, and I will ask you to keep it short, maybe talk about one thing that you are looking forward to in the year ahead that you think could really make a positive change, just so we end on a little bit of a positive note.
Can you start?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm really glad that Jihad brought up the issue of value chain. I think for me, what I've seen the most in my experience working in the development sector, which I would like to see a change and more attention paid to, which is a value chain approach and a holistic market systems approach. And this is as relevant for economic growth overall, as well as women's economic empowerment and integration into new sectors of the economy. Thus far, a lot of the work that we have done has focused either at women at the bottom, focusing at the micro sector, or women at the top, cultivating the leadership at the top. We need a whole lot more going on in the middle. It's just the simple fact. It's where the economy is going to grow, and it's not where a lot of the attention has been paid. And I think part of that is because we need to spend more time addressing the barriers along particular value chains where we see the greatest opportunity for growth. So we need to get down into the nitty-gritty, as one of my co-panelists said earlier, and really break down these issues at the value chain level, not just for women, of course, but recognizing, as you said, that if we bring women into the sector, right now women are employed at half the rate of men in most Middle Eastern countries. And I think that at this point, the positive outlook for me is that it's no longer about making the case for gender inclusion or for gender equality and for gender parity and for equal wages. The economic imperative is there, and we see that governments in the Middle East are actually making a commitment to change.
So I'll finish on a controversial topic. Somebody mentioned civil unrest in the region. That's certainly very risky in that part of the world, and certainly very, very risky in the short term. But once again, looking at the positive side of it, that at least the people are no longer asleep at the switch. And the people are rising in a way, first of all, that's peaceful. And they're saying that we're starting to hold our leaders accountable to deliver on all the things we talked about here. And most importantly, I do believe that there are people around the region who are listening and are willing to respond to that pressure. So leaving on a controversial but optimistic note.
Well, depending on a commodity, a single commodity, whether oil or gas or both, is a dangerous thing. In the past, we thought that oil was very scarce, and so policies were based on that, and prices were kept relatively high. Until in this country we developed the technology to develop what we call oil from the source rock rather than from what is around the source rock. And so over a 10-year period, the United States added more production of oil and natural gas liquid than anybody ever did anywhere in the world. We had 10 million barrels a day. Nobody's ever done that before. Now, the future different, we don't know yet. We are now repeating the same thing in natural gas, LNG exports. Now, there's a dramatic impact on the price of LNG, so that impacts Qatar, impacts Australia and others. And on the oil side, we don't know yet what's going to happen. OPEC is more pessimistic than I am. I think we reached, if they can keep that price level about where it is now, which means less revenue than they would like to have, but then US expansion of production will start slowing down significantly. If they go up, because the budget needs, like in Saudi case, I think IMF produced something like $85 a barrel, I think for the fiscal deficit. If you want to go and bridge that gap, the price goes up to $85, bang, in the United States, you see massive increase of investment in tight oil. But what they themselves can do, I think, first of all, they should go to an income tax rather than a value-added tax. Value-added tax has a disproportionate impact on the relatively low incomes. But the well-off people, I lived there for 10 years, I have a feeling for it, live very well. And you could easily have an income tax and siphon some of that rent away to reduce the budget deficit. Education, match new requirements with what you're actually teaching the people in your secondary schools. There's the college-educated ones, particularly those who go outside, but even many go inside, is very good. It's what do you do with the ones who don't go to college? So that has to be significantly improved to make it possible to these projects. And then when you do make the investments, like the deciding now with the IPO, what you're going to do with this money, make sure that you focus not on capital-intensive projects, but on labor-intensive projects, such as tourism. Okay, it's a lot of job. Last week I was in Oman, in the Intercontinental Hotel, and they told me that 80% of the workforce in that hotel now is Omanized. When I first was there in 1985, maybe 2%. So you are areas where major progress can be made, and tourism is one of them.
Jihad, you want to finish this up?
Okay, I will start with integration. And I think recognizing two things for 2020 is important. One is fighting corruption is a priority for integration. It's not only to improve good governance, and recognize also income disparity and lack of inclusion because of issues related to socioeconomic issues. It's priority number one for 2020. And the fact that we are seeing a new generation coming into the social and decision-making arena is an opportunity for that. The second one is innovation. And innovation is the way for the region to leapfrog, both in terms of technology, in terms of diversification, in terms of addressing some of the issues. And therefore, I think innovation is an important dimension that we need to nurture. 3 is integration. Integration within the same economy, because we have within the country, we have now silos that are being built. We need to integrate them. We need to integrate more regionally, and also we need to integrate more globally. Therefore, I think in 2020, we have, for the region, the opportunity to, I would say, do something that has not been done over the last 10 years, recognize that the change is not only something that can be addressed by changing the people who are governing, but also by going at the root cause of some of the issues that countries are facing and address them.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much.